So now that you've got Android Studio installed, let's get it up and running and have a look at how we can make our first basic app and run it right here on the emulator. So I'm on my Mac here and I'm going to use Command Space and just type Android Studio there to get it up and running. You of course will need to load it in the usual way if you're on a PC, but everything else works exactly the same. And then in the Android Studio menu, I'm going to click File and New Project. Here we go. So this is the New Project dialog. Most of this we can just leave as the default. I'm going to change the application name to My First Android App. I suggest you do the same, but it really doesn't matter. The company domain is much like a domain name really. It doesn't have to be one that you own, but it just contains the information about your company, as it were. So we've got an example company here and then my name within that. And you can see that that's important because a package name will be created from that company name. And the package name is a bit like the domain name, but in reverse. So with the com at the end, we have the com at the beginning now, and then the company name example here, then my name, and then the name of the app in a lowercase without any spaces or strange characters. So I'm just going to make that robpercival.com. I'll use that as my company domain, but you can use anything you like. It really doesn't matter at this stage. And then project location is just where on your machine that's saved, and I would leave that as the default. So then I'm going to click Next, and here we've got the options of the different platforms that we can support. At this stage we're going to keep things very simple and just use the defaults. So we want phone and tablet, and you can see we can choose the various different versions of Android that we want to support. I'm just going to stick with the default. Obviously the newer you use, the more APIs and functions you have available to you, but the more likelihood you're going to have of getting devices that can't download your app. So this default seems like a reasonable compromise because we've got 90.4% of devices at this point using that level of API. And we're not going to be developing for Android TV or Android Wear in this course, so we'll stick with just phone and tablet. Then click Next. Now here we've got a list of activities. This is our first keyword that we need to learn for the course. An activity is essentially a page of your app. So an app might have several different activities. One of them might have a map on like this, one of them might have a settings menu a bit like this, and you might have just a main blank activity that you start with where you put the content of your app. If you've done some iOS development, an activity is very similar to a view controller in terms of the language. So essentially it's a page of your app, and we will be looking at these other options later on, but for now we're just going to stick to blank activity. And then we just click Next. And here we get to customize the names of our activity. So the default is main activity, and I'm going to leave everything as the default here. Really, you only need to customize these if you're going to have several different activities and you want to specify which one the first one is, and then when you bring the other activities in, then you'll know which one you're referring to. But if you're only going to have one activity, as we are at the moment, then just sticking with the default is definitely a good idea. Okay, so that's all the options. So just click Finish, and then it will generate everything you need for your apps. We can see we're using a product called Gradle, which is the build engine for Android Studio. If you want to find out more about Gradle, then just have a Google. What is Gradle? Essentially, it's a build tool that Android uses to create the app from the files that you create. Okay, so now this looks a little bit horrendous, and there's a lot here to get to grips with, of course. But don't be put off. We'll do it step by step, and I'll go through each of the different sections of this layout. And within 5 to 10 minutes, you'll be completely happy, I hope, with everything on this screen, and we will have run our first little Android app as well. So first of all, this is our main Android Studio page, and along here you've got all your usual, or some of your usual options for your app. So we've got open, save, refresh, and cut and copy paste, etc. The most important one really for that line is this play button here. Don't click it quite yet, but that's our Run App button, which will allow us to run the app in the emulator right there on your computer. And then we've got some other icons that we'll look at later on in the course. Then, moving down, this line here just tells us what folder we're in within our app. So we're in the app folder, and then the SRC, which is short for source, so the source code essentially, and then at the moment we're in Android test, the Android test folder, and then we're in the Java folder within that. So it just shows you where you are within the app. And on the left-hand side here of the screen, we've got a list of all of the folders and files in the app. So I'll just very quickly run through those. We've got our main app folder here, and then this top folder gives us a manifests folder, and then within that we've got an Android manifest.xml. If I double click on that, it will appear in the main area here. Essentially this just stores some information about your app, so that the basic information. We've got the theme, we've got the title, we've got the icon, etc., etc. This is in a language called XML, which you don't need to worry too much about at this stage, but we will be looking at later on. Essentially, all you need to know at this point is that this file contains the core information about the app. Okay. Then we've got this Java folder, which is where our code for the app will exist and be stored, and the main file that we're interested in here is the main activity there. So if I just double click on there, this is the code that gets us up and running, essentially, that runs our app. Now at this point, don't worry at all about the actual content of this code. We're going to look at that in the next video, but for now all we need to be aware of is that this main activity file is the one that we're going to be editing most of the time in order to make our app do something. Then we've got our Android test folder. We don't need to worry too much about that at this point. And then we've got our res folder, which is our resources folder, and it's got all the layout guides and images that we might use in our app. The particular bit that we're interested in here is the file that was actually shown at the launch of the app, and that's activity-main.xml, which contains information for this activity about what it actually looks like. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And then we've got some more layout folders there, which we'll look at later on in the course. And finally, we've got some Gradle scripts. So this allows you to run certain scripts every time your app is built. That's quite an advanced feature that we don't need to look at this point, but we will look at later on. Okay. Now moving into this kind of central pane, which shows us the information on the thing that we're looking at the moment, so this activity main file. And you can see the most exciting thing is our little screenshot on our Android device there. So this is what our app looks like right now. And down here, we've got various things that we can add to our app just by dragging and dropping. So we've got some layouts, we've got some widgets. You can recognize some of those, buttons, small buttons, etc. We've got some text fields that we can add, some containers, and a lot more. We'll be looking at all of those later on. Feel free to have a little play around and see what happens when you drag them in to the app. We'll spend a lot more time on layout later on, but you can see that it's trying to decide where to put your object, and then if we just let go, then it puts it in that way. So I'm going to Command Z to just get rid of that, and feel free to just play around a little bit with that as much as you'd like. Now moving over to here, we've got some default options for the app, so we can change the orientation of our device. There we go, to see how our app would look like in that orientation. We can also change the theme of the app, so we're on just the default app theme here. If I click on there, we've got various different themes. Those words may be familiar to you if you've followed the development of Android over the last few years. Let's just pick another one. So Material Light is quite nice. If we click on that, you can see it just changes the look of everything, and we get our nice menu bar at the top there. Then we can zoom in and out using those buttons there, and if we click the little page button there, that takes us to another XML file, which is the code for producing this layout here. So all the information on this layout is stored in this code. And we can actually switch back and forth between the code and the design just by clicking those tabs at the bottom there. So most of the time we're going to be looking in the design tab in this course, but we will look at text every now and again, and I'll show you just how the screen setup can be created either with the design or with text, depending on which you're most comfortable with. Okay, those other little bits around there we'll look at later on. And on the right here, this might look like a very strange component tree, but it's actually quite straightforward. We've got the device screen is our kind of ultimate layout object, and then within that we've got a relative layout setup, which helps us to create different layouts for different screen sizes and different orientations. And then within our relative layout we've got our one object, which is our text view. So that's the little hello world that it's created for us by default there. And if we just double click on that hello world, you can see we've got some text. We can change that to whatever we like. I'm going to change it to hi. In fact, I'll call it hi Rob. And you can put your name there. And then we can add an ID for that object as well. And then that will allow us to refer to it in code later on if we want to. So we can hide it or display it or move it around or do whatever we like with it. And I'm just going to put a default ID in there. So I'm going to call it hi Rob. And you can see I've made everything lowercase there apart from the beginning of Rob. And that's our general convention that we'll use for IDs and any kind of variable name. That everything will be lowercase apart from the beginning of each word. So in this case, just the R. And then enter to save that. There we go. And then, almost at the end of this now, down here we've got all of the properties of this particular object. So our text view there, and we can change all of these things if we want to change the look and the feel of our app. So in the next video we'll be looking at text in a lot more detail, and we'll see what effects some of these options have and how we can change the layout, the color, the style and everything else of the text. But for now I'm going to end this video by showing you how we can actually run this app in the emulator, as I mentioned earlier. So let's press the run button, and then that will start to build the app, and once it's built we'll have the option to actually run it in an emulator, which is a kind of pretend phone that runs within your computer and allows you to see how the app is going to behave without actually running it on a real phone. So we've got the option here, launch emulator. So far we don't actually have any emulators. You may have some default ones there, but I don't, so I'm going to show you how to create a new one. So we just click on the ... and we want to create a virtual device, which is just another way of saying an emulator, a device that runs in your computer. And then you've got all these options of devices that you can emulate. I'm actually going to choose the Nexus 4 here, just because the screen resolution works quite nicely on the machine I'm using here. But you can choose any device you like. I recommend choosing the one that fits better on the screen resolution that you're working with. So then we just click next. And here we can choose any version of Android to run on our phone. I would again go for the default, so I'm just going to pick Lollipop there and then click next. And again we've got some options that we can customize if we like, the name for the Android virtual device, the scale, etc, etc. And I'm going to leave all those options as the default. I'd recommend you do the same. And then we'll click finish. And there we go, that's created the device for us there. So if we close that down, we go back to our running options, and then we can select our device right there. And then I'm going to click use same device for future launches, just so I don't have to choose the device every time. Alright, then we'll click OK. And you can see that we've got a bunch of information about our device as it's being launched, and then it should pop up. There we go. So you can see my device there. Probably the bottom part of the device is going to be cut off for you, but you can see the whole screen at least. So that's the important part. Now I'm just going to speed up the video whilst Android is being started up on this phone, so you don't have to watch the whole process. Here we go. So now we've got our phone up and running. Let's unlock it just by dragging up, and you can see right there we've got our first Android app. So very exciting. We've now built our first app, which is slightly customized from the default, not by much, but a little bit. And a final thing to show you is this log here, which shows you a huge amount of information. It is extremely useful, particularly when you're getting errors, but we'll look at that a little bit later on and see how we can use the log to work out what's wrong with our code and fix it. Okay, so now we've finished our look around the Android Studio. I hope now you feel that you have a fairly good idea how it all fits together and how this rather complicated screen actually functions. And in the next video, as I mentioned, we're going to look at text and how we can add that to our app and then customize our various different chunks of text. I'll see you there.